Jews knew they now had enough to charge him with blasphemy, but as I said, that wasn't enough for the Romans. So they had to change the charge when they brought him before Pontius Pilate. And that's the first of the civil trials, the trial before Pilate. It's described in Luke 23, verses 1-4. Now remember, Tiberius was the emperor of Rome. He was in charge of all the Roman Empire that included Israel. He resided in Rome. But the Romans put different governors in charge of different sections of Israel to carry out Roman law. Pontius Pilate was the governor, the procurator, if you will, of Judea, the southern part of Israel. Now, normally, Pontius Pilate resided in his beautiful palatial estate at Caesarea by the sea. Again, a few weeks ago, about 400 of us went to Caesarea by the sea to see the remains of Pilate's palace there. And you can go in and see a recreation of what it was. It was unbelievable. No wonder he spent most of his time there by the sea. But because it was Passover and so many Jews would be in Jerusalem, he thought he better be in Jerusalem to maintain order in the city. By the way, let me just insert here. For the first 1900 years of Christianity, there was absolutely zero archaeological confirmation that somebody named Pontius Pilate even existed. In fact, critics of the Bible scoffed at the idea. One more myth in the Bible, some guy named Pontius Pilate. Well, guess what? Down at Caesarea by the sea in 1961, an Italian archaeologist found a stone. We call it today the Pilate stone. That in fact noted that the governor of Judea during the time of Christ, the very years of Christ, was a man named Pontius Pilate. One more archaeological confirmation of validity of the Bible. Now, a lot of people, when they think of Pilate, they think of the Pilate they see in these little documentaries or in these made-for-TV movies that portray Pilate as some Casper milquetoast, vacillating, doesn't know what to do. You've seen that kind of Pilate. That's not the Pontius Pilate of history. History tells us, and we know a lot more about him since 1961, he was a bloodthirsty anti-Semite. He hated the Jewish people. And in fact, he was so hated that there were several failed coups against Pontius Pilate. And back in Rome, the Roman officials were very concerned about Pilate. They wanted to keep the peace. They didn't like all the rumblings they were hearing from Judea. And there was an investigation going on at this time of whether or not Pilate ought to be relieved of his duty. And that's why he was so troubled about this Jesus issue. This presented a real threat to his reign as governor if he made the wrong decision. Now, look at verse 1. So then the whole body of Jews arose and brought Jesus before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Two charges. First of all, he says you can't pay taxes. You shouldn't pay taxes. Now, that was an outright lie, wasn't it? Remember the disciples said to Jesus, "Is it right for us to pay taxes?" Jesus held up a Roman coin and said what? "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." Yes, it's lawful to pay taxes. But what about this second charge? And he also says that he himself is a king. Well, the fact is he did claim to be a king. So Pilate asked him about that. Verse 3, and Pilate said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered him and said, It is as you say. And Pilate said to the chief priest and the multitudes, "I find no guilt in this man." But wait a minute. Wasn't that treason to claim to be a king? Why wasn't Pilate troubled by that? Because in John 18:36, we find something else that Jesus said. None of the Gospels contradict one another, but they do complement one another. Some give different information that others don't have. And here's the word that Jesus added in John 18:36. He said, "My kingdom, Pilate, is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting that I might not be delivered up to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." When Pilate heard that, "I don't have anything to worry about," he said. And so he said to the masses, "I find no fault in him. Let him go." But the Jews wouldn't have that. Luke 23 says, they said, "But Pilate, this man Jesus, he's been causing trouble. He's been leading an insurrection from his starting place in Galilee all the way down to Judea." And as soon as Pilate heard the word Galilee, a light bulb went on in his mind. Galilee, he's from Galilee? Yes, he's from Galilee, the northern region. Pilate said, "Oh, he's talking to the wrong person. You see, I'm not the governor of Galilee. I'm the governor of Judea. It's Herod Antipas. He's the procurator of Galilee, and guess what? He just happens to be in town right now. He's staying right up the street at the Hasmonean Palace. You just take Jesus up there to Herod and let him deal with it." So he said, okay. They were getting the governmental bureaucratic runaround. So they said, all right, we'll take him up to see Herod. And you see that trial before Herod in Luke 23, verses 8 to 11. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. Now Herod knew about Jesus by reputation. He had heard of the miraculous things that he had wanted to do, and Jesus knew about Herod as well. Remember, it was Herod Antipas, the fox, who had beheaded John the Baptist. But today, for some reason, Herod wasn't in a beheading mood. He was in a celebratory mood. Perhaps it was the spirit of the festival of the day that got to him, but he just decided to have some fun with Jesus. Talked to him a little bit, dressed him up in a robe, gave him a scepter, and sent him back to Pontius Pilate. And that leads to the final trial before Pilate. Just imagine, it's about 7 o'clock Friday morning. Pilate's having his second cup of coffee, reading the Jerusalem Times. And he looks up and he sees Jesus being brought back to him. He thinks, oh no, not again. I thought I'd gotten rid of this. He's looking for a way out of this. And then suddenly he remembers something. Matthew 27, verse 15. Now at the feast, the governor, that is Pilate, was accustomed to release for the multitude any one prisoner whom they wanted. And they were holding at that time a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. The Romans wanted to keep peace with the Jews, and so as a way of showing respect for their Jewish religion, every time of the year at the Passover, they said, you know, you're celebrating God's releasing you from Egyptian captivity. We're going to pay respect to you by allowing you to choose one of your own prisoners that we will release. And so Pilate remembered that. He knew that there was a prisoner being held named Barabbas, a murderer. Many people believe that third cross was actually intended for Barabbas. And so he realized he could give them a choice. He reminded them of the feast, and he said to them, look at verse 17, whom do you want me to release for you? Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Christ? He thought that there's an easy answer to that. Why, everybody would choose Jesus. I mean, he might be a little nuts, but at least he's harmless. He's a good person. Certainly you'll choose him over this hardened criminal, this murderer. Who would want him on the streets again? But to Pilate's dismay, the people yelled out, Barabbas, Barabbas. Well, then what shall I do with Jesus? He asked. And they yelled, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate knew at that point he had no choice. He was ready to dispose of the matter, so ignoring his own conscience, ignoring his wife's advice, he ordered for Jesus to be scourged and crucified. The Jewish historian Klausner says that death by crucifixion is the most cruel and shameful death ever devised by man. You know, our Supreme Court 2 weeks ago was debating a case about how painless execution should be. In our system, it's the law that Execution ought to be as painless as possible. But the Romans thought differently. They wanted to make it as painful as possible. And through the years, they had devised different means of executing people: boiling people in oil, drowning them, burning them alive. But the problem with all of those methods was that the prisoner died too quickly. They wanted him to agonize as long as possible, and thus crucifixion was invented. One scholar describes the horror of Christ's crucifixion this way: we're getting ready to walk on holy ground here for the next few moments. Preparations for the scourging are carried out. The prisoner is stripped of his clothing and his hands tied to a post above his head. The Roman legionnaire steps forward with a whip in his hand. This is a short whip consisting of several heavy leather thongs with 2 small balls of lead attached to the ends of each. The heavy whip is brought down with full force again and again across Jesus' shoulders, back, and legs. At first, the heavy thongs cut through the skin only. Then, as the blows continue, they cut deeper into tissues, producing first an oozing of blood from the capillaries and veins of the skin, and finally spurting arterial bleeding from vessels in the underlying muscles. The small balls of lead first produce sharp, deep bruises, which are broken open by subsequent blows. Finally, the skin of the back is hanging in long ribbons, and the entire area is unrecognizable as a mass of torn, bleeding tissue. When it's determined by the centurion in charge that the prisoner is near death, the beating is stopped. The heavy beam of the cross is then tied across his shoulders, and the procession of the condemned Christ, 2 thieves, and the execution detail begins its slow journey. The weight of the heavy wooden beam, together with the shock produced by copious blood loss, is too much. Jesus stumbles and falls. The rough wood of the beam gouges into the lacerated skin and muscles of his shoulders. He tries to rise, but human muscles have been pushed beyond their endurance. At Golgotha, the beam is placed on the ground, and Jesus is quickly thrown backward with his shoulders against the wood. The legionnaire feels for the depression at the front of Jesus' wrist. He drives a heavy, square wrought iron nail through the wrist and deep into the wood. Quickly, he moves to the other side and repeats the action, being careful not to pull the arms too tightly, but to allow some movement. The beam is then lifted in place at the top of the posts, and the sign reading "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," is nailed into place. As the arms fatigue, great waves of cramps sweep over the muscles, knotting them in deep, relentless, throbbing pain. With these cramps come the inability to push himself upward. Hanging by his arms, the pectoral muscles are unable to act. Air can be drawn into the lungs, but it cannot be exhaled. Jesus fights to raise himself in order to get even one short breath. Finally, the carbon dioxide builds up in the lungs and in the bloodstream, and the cramps partially subside. Spasmodically, he is able to push himself upward to exhale. Hours of this limitless pain, cycles of twisting, joint cramps, intermittent partial asphyxiation, searing pain as tissue is torn from his lacerated back as he moves up and down against the rough timber. He can feel the chill of death creeping through his tissues. With one last surge of strength, he once again presses his torn feet against the nail, straightens his legs, takes a deeper breath, and utters his 7th and last cry: "Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit." And for those 6 hours, he looked down at the crowd and he said to his father, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." There were two men that Good Friday who experienced Christ's forgiveness. One we all know, the thief on the cross who was next to Jesus, who said, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus said to him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." But the first person who in history ever experienced Christ's substitutionary death for him was that prisoner, Barabbas. In his book, The Darkness and the Dawn, Chuck Swindoll uses his imagination based on historical fact to recreate what actually happened with Barabbas. Remember, Jesus was standing before Pilate in the open courtyard at Antonio's. Fortress. About 2,000 feet away, one level below, Barabbas was being held as a prisoner in that very same facility. Because of his distance away from Pilate and Jesus, obviously Barabbas could not hear anything Pilate was saying, but he could hear the roar of the crowd. For example, when Pilate said to the crowd, "Whom would you like me to release, Jesus or Barabbas?" Barabbas didn't hear that question, but he did hear the crowd starting to yell his name. "Barabbas! Barabbas! Barabbas!" Perhaps hope began to swell in his own heart as he thought, maybe finally the Jews are getting the courage to lead an insurrection against these Roman captors. And maybe they're calling for me to lead the revolt. Barabbas! 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 But Barabbas didn't hear the next question. What should I do with Jesus? But then he heard the crowd yell, "Crucify him! Crucify him! Crucify him!" All Barabbas could hear was, "Barabbas, Barabbas, Barabbas. Crucify him! Crucify him! Crucify him!" A short time afterwards, he heard those dread footsteps against the pavement of the Roman soldiers approaching him. He knew what was ahead, the horrible death he was about to entail. But imagine his surprise when the prison door was flung open. The soldier grabbed Barabbas by the shoulder and said, "You are free. Get out of here." Another man, Jesus, is dying in your place. Jesus died that day, not only in the place of Barabbas, but in the place of you and me. In some inexplicable way, when Jesus died on the cross, he experienced the wrath, the punishment of God that you and I deserve. 2 Corinthians